audit fans, Dr. Amanda here with our 7th video in our series about auditing standards. And today I'm tackling a huge one, which is ASA240, our responsibilities in regards to fraud. Now, this is a pretty huge standard. When I actually look at the number of pages, this thing is 44 pages long. And that's probably a whole lot bigger than any of the standards we've looked at before. So there's going to be sort of 2 parts to this. I'm going to go through the standard, and then in a separate video, I'm also going to talk about some implications, especially because of some US decisions and a whole change in the audit landscape. So let's dig into the standard first. We normally start with our contents, and so we've got our introduction, what audit is all about and fraud is all about, our requirements, and then you might notice here, let me scroll down a bit. So this is pages. Requirements is those particular sections, but look at the size of the explanatory material. This actually goes over another page. And so there is a stack of information here because fraud is an area that is really open to auditor judgment. And it's about how we perceive risks of fraud. And you can see that it goes over to the other side. The only section of the explanatory material I'm really going to get into today is this one, which is the example of fraud risk factors. They're often called red flags, so things that could be potential indicators of fraud. Obviously, ISA and ASA240 conform, so they're all the same. So if you're international studying ISAs, then this video is going to be just as appropriate. Now, I know that when I'm doing my audit is about providing reasonable assurance. Okay, I know that my audit is not a guarantee. Okay, an audit is definitely not about a guarantee. And we know that because we don't test all of our transactions. We're only testing a sample of transactions to provide this reasonable level of assurance. So what are my responsibilities in regard to fraud? Well, this standard is actually going to tell us. It's going to tell us, well, what exactly are the auditor's responsibility relating to fraud? Do we have to search for it? How much looking do we need to do? If we think there's fraud, what are our requirements? Now I'm going to start with characteristics, and this is sort of like definitions. So misstatements in the report can come from fraud or error. Errors are mistakes. Fraud has that intention to mislead or deceive. So we're concerned with fraud about the financial report, but there could be fraud that you might uncover in different areas. Now, there are 2 types of intentional misstatements within the financials. The first one is, do this in a different color, fraudulent financial reporting. That's essentially lying about the numbers. And then the second one is called misappropriation of, and what you don't see there but over the other page, is misappropriation of assets, which is essentially the idea of theft. So there are 2 types of fraud. Fraudulent financial reporting, which is really lying and manipulating the financials, and stealing stuff. So whose responsibility is it for the prevention and detection of fraud? Now this is really interesting because in almost every single country in the world, the responsibility for the prevention and detection of fraud lies with those charged with governance. So essentially, that's one particular group. It's going to be management, it's going to be our board of directors. So they are responsible for designing internal controls to try and prevent or detect fraud. So that's their job. All right. There are some standard things that we should think about. So a culture of honesty and ethical behaviour. That's one of the reasons why later on when we get to ISA315, we're actually going to look at the environment of the firm, the culture of the organisation, because that foundation will affect the propensity for there to be fraud. So the responsibility for the prevention and detection of fraud lies with management. But what are the auditor's responsibilities? Because we are checking the financial statements. All right, remember we're giving reasonable assurance that the financial report as a whole is free from material misstatements caused by fraud or error. So we're looking for errors, but we're also keeping our eye out for fraud. Okay, so there might be some limitations of doing an audit. We might not be able to detect fraud if there is a carefully organised scheme, so if management are colluding together. There could be forgery or a deliberate failure to record transactions or misrepresentations. So there could be concealment and collusion that would actually prevent the auditor from being able to detect fraud. So we have to be sort of a little bit like human lie detectors. We have to figure out, well, are these people actually telling the truth? Does all the other evidence actually match up to go with that? So this is part of our responsibility. We have to consider about whether there is the potential opportunity for fraud. Now, fraud can be conducted at a number of different levels. It could be conducted by employees, or it could be conducted by management. Now, management quite often have the ability to override any internal controls we might have in the company. So management fraud could be much more difficult to detect than employee fraud. But regardless, I have to have professional skepticism. So that means I need to have, remember we discussed this in one of our earlier videos, a questioning mind. Okay, we need to move away from trust but verify. We need to move to this questioning mind process. So we need to consider, does this make sense? Does this evidence look appropriate? Now, when it comes to fraud, and that's gone through our objectives, well, what do I have to do as the auditor? I have a couple of different jobs. I have to identify any risks of misstatement due to fraud. I have to collect evidence if there is a risk about whether there could be fraud, and respond appropriately if we think there might be fraud within the audit. Now, I've talked about professional skepticism before and that idea of the questioning mind. We've got a whole lot of information about the definitions. And this is a really interesting point here. Unless the auditor has reason to believe the contrary, we may accept records or documents as genuine. Now, we don't believe that every document is fake, but I look at those documents and I say, does this look like an electricity bill I've got at home? Does this match up with what I know that particular supplier's documentation might be? If we're suspicious, then we look into authenticity. So if there's inconsistencies of what management tell us or what documents tell us, then we do need to make sure that we follow it up. Now, remember how I said that quite often on audits, there's lots of different people all working together in different parts of the account. So this person might be auditing accounts receivable, this person might be auditing cash, but what we know from double entry bookkeeping is that these two parts of the audit might be linked. So to make sure that we're considering fraud from all angles, teams have to discuss. All right. So amongst team members, we talk with the partner if there is a particular instance of fraud, and we have to identify if there are any potential risks. So there might be some brainstorming that goes on that talks about, is there the possibility of fraud? Now, risk is the key word here because our audit is risk-based. All right, we provide risk-based audits, and that means that we focus more on areas where there's greater risk and less where there's areas on lower risk. So I have to identify, is there a propensity for there to be a risk due to fraud? All right, so how do I do that? Number one, I make inquiries with management. I talk to them, has there been any fraud? Are there any issues? So I start with talking to management and then talking to internal audit. So here I'm sort of looking for a bit of my spidey sense. Does anything spark as unusual? Do management seem like they're trying to deflect or prevent us from understanding something? I will talk with those charged with governance. So that's typically the board of directors or the audit committee. I'll see if there's any unusual or unexpected relationships, like related parties. I could do some analytical procedures to see if anything is moving in the wrong direction. And then I have to evaluate the fraud risk factors. Okay, so how do I actually do that? Well, my next set of paragraphs actually says, so 26 onwards says that I have to consider risks of misstatement due to fraud. So we have a few particular areas where there are specifics that are high risk. So revenue recognition is one of those. And in the explanatory material, there's lots of information about revenue recognition. But I should look for these risks of material misstatement due to fraud and assess, is it likely? All right. Is it likely to happen, and what evidence do I need to collect to prove that it might be happening or it might not be happening? Now, when I come to responding, so I've found a potential risk of fraud, and one thing I want to raise quickly here, is something called the fraud risk triangle. Now, the fraud risk triangle says that risk factors generally tend to fall into one of a number of different categories. We have opportunities to engage in fraud, and that could be because we have a poor internal control system. The next one is that we might have some sort of incentive or pressure to engage in fraud. So that incentive could be management compensation plans or employee bonus schemes, or it could be some sort of external pressure, like you're addicted to gambling. And then the last one is the attitude or rationalization. And this is where culture comes into play of the firm. Oops, I can't spell rationalization. Is what are employees' attitudes towards fraud? Is it, oh, well, I deserve this money because I've been passed over for a promotion? Is management saying, oh, look, screw the customer, we're in this to make money for ourselves? What is it about the firm or attitudes of individuals that might give rise to fraud? So all of these three give rise to fraud risk factors. All right, so you might see, and you don't have to have all three, you might have an opportunity, there might be an incentive, or there might be an attitude or rationalization that creates a risk factor. So if we find a risk factor, then what do we have to do? Well, we have to respond, and that could be in a few different ways. So it might be to have people investigate. So right here they talk about having people investigate, and see if there is some issue. We might need to design and perform audit procedures who are looking at fraud for that particular area. We might even need to call in an expert. All right, so you never go to management and say, I think you're engaged in fraud. We'll do our own quiet investigation. All right. You don't necessarily you might talk to the Audit Committee, but you will probably not go to management at this point. So you'll do your own quiet investigation without raising any alarms. You don't want to tell somebody, oh, I'm investigating you for fraud. They might burn all the evidence and disappear. So we have to do some responses to those risks, and then we have to consider, is it possible that management are going to override internal controls? And if that is the case, then we do have a potential fraud risk that we need to work around or change our audit for. Now, for all of these, if we discover some sort of risk, we need to change our audit. We need to change our audit strategy and our audit plan to respond to risk. We have to go away and do a whole lot of evaluation of evidence. It's very rare that you'd be able to, unable to continue the audit engagement, like it says down here in paragraph 39, but you do need to evaluate the evidence and see if something looks suspicious. All right. If there is something that could be fraud, then we have to think about, well, could this flow on to other areas? How will this affect the rest of my audit? We also need to get some written representations from management. So they acknowledge, remember we said that it's responsibility of management that they have to design, implement and maintain internal controls to prevent fraud. They've disclosed to auditors any risk factors and that they've disclosed any fraud or suspected fraud that they know has been going on. And then we'll talk with management and the audit committee about all of these areas. Now, an important factor down here is this one. Right? If we think that there is fraud, then what we need to do is if we've identified fraud or have obtained information that indicates fraud might exist, I have to communicate these matters with the appropriate level of management. So what does it mean by the appropriate level of management? It's usually one level above where, the fraud took place. Now this can be really tricky because what if there's the potential for management to be colluding in this situation? If you're really stuck and you think, I don't know how high it goes, then your best bet is to go to talk to the audit committee, because our audit committee should be made up of independent board members if you don't know where the fraud ends in terms of the hierarchy. If we do think that the fraud is quite serious and it breaches a legal requirement, then we are required to report to the appropriate outside entity. So if we find an environmental spill, we might need to report to the EPA. Or if we're auditing a bank and we find some inconsistencies or illegal behaviour, then we might need to report to APRA, which is the Banking Regulatory Authority for Financial Institutions. So we have a lot of people that we need to consider if we find fraud. Now, we don't want to say anything too early, but we don't want to leave it too late either, because we want to make sure that we were not helping management cover anything up. Now, documentation is always key. Remember I said that if it's not documented, we don't do something. So we have to document everything that we might consider as fraud, why we removed it from consideration later, or why we're going to follow up in that documentation area. I'm not going to go into detail in the standard. All right, I've talked enough for this particular portion of the video. The next video, which you'll be able to click through to, will talk about what you should do in regards to fraud risk factors, and I'll go through the appendices. Thanks for watching. Make sure you give us a like and subscribe to the channel for more videos.